Welcome back to Watch a First-Time DM Run Storm King's Thunder. Today we're going to talk about campaign planning. As someone who has only ever been responsible for one character, I always found the vastness of a potential adventure to be the most daunting aspect of running the game. The first time, it has felt like knowing everything is necessary to start anything. So this video is about what I've learned about right-sizing that process and hopefully giving you some ideas and tools to help you do the same. The structure and lessons I've learned are applicable to any campaign, but I'm running Storm King's Thunder, so the examples that I'll use will support that adventure specifically. That means there will be spoilers for the story of Storm King's Thunder and my campaign specifically. So if you ever plan on playing Storm Kings or are one of the 4 guys in my game right now, please do not watch this. There are 5 steps. I'll share why I found each so helpful personally and some quick examples of how I applied them to a large-scale campaign. Starting with, read the book. Yeah, number 1 is read the book. Before you do anything else, read the full adventure cover to cover. This is the only step without a tangible output, but falling in love with the core story beats of Storm King's Thunder is the reason I was able to overcome my Dungeon Master anxiety. Even though I saw the gaps and flaws in its guidance, I thought the journey and villains and stakes were so cool, were so epic, that I wanted to be the one to empower my friends to experience that world. And that reality was enough for me to make everything else work. You have to love your story, or I think you're going to find the rest of this really exhausting. Conversely, if you find inspiration from that adventure, it becomes so much easier to add definition to that high-level narrative and aesthetic when we frame your world. This exercise is in service of your session 0, so you only need to spend as much time here as is necessary to frame the setting to your group and to give them ideas on how their characters might hook into the world. We're going to use the characters, their backstories, and what they care about to focus the details that we'll build out. So here is my right-sized 3-item list for world building after you've read the book, but before your session 0. The state of the world, generally. So are things happy and prosperous? Are they bleak and violent? If you lived in your world and described the day-to-day vibe to a neighbor, what might you say? The scope and setting of travel generally. So will your party be exploring dense cities or more sweeping wild landscape? Will they be expecting to traverse across continents, or will it be very geographically focused? And finally, the state of the main threat as your players' characters would have experienced it. The catalyst for your campaign might still be a whisper in the darkest tavern corners, or it could be extremely tangible and forces might already be mobilizing against it. Both are great, but they introduce different levels of urgency that might inspire your players differently. And that's it. State, scale, and urgency. D&D is collaborative storytelling right from the beginning. And what I've found is that bringing your players in and allowing their curiosity and energy to form a world that's still being refined has not only made my job much easier, but way more fun. For my version of Storm King's Thunder, the world is prosperous and happy, or has been until very recently. My players know that they should expect to explore a few urban locations and travel between them before likely being drawn into a more wild northern mountain region. And the giant attacks, the main beginning catalyst for the campaign, the one on the cover of the book, are still scattered. Alarming, but not urgent yet. So I sent essentially just those ideas with a little bit more detail and background to my players about a week before our session 0, so they could feel prepared and get excited. I've included the link to that document exactly as I wrote it, and they saw it in the description below as one example of how those 3 ideas can get you and your players started. Okay, there are a lot of great approaches for running a session 0, and there are a lot of amazing resources available to you and me teaching those approaches. Regardless of the exact shape that yours takes, you should think about it as both a vehicle for player buy-in and comfort, but also as a tool for us as new DMs to prepare exactly the right amount of story, which is what step 4 is all about. One of the things that intimidated me about starting an adventure, part of the vastness that we talked about earlier, was the prospect of making my players and their characters care. Beyond the fact that they're my friends and they want to play D&D, why should they care? What I found is that using my session 0 to connect even a single thread of my player's character's backstory to a specific element of my campaign that I'm excited about running evaporated that anxiety. So my mountain dwarf wants to trade with the fire giants instead of fighting them. So the fire giants can be a secondary antagonist, and I know that he'll feel authentically compelled to seek them out outside of any specific hook that I may give. Or my Harengon fighter's Fey patron sent him to investigate the origin of the giant attacks personally. So the Feywild, a plane and location that I otherwise likely would not have pulled into the narrative, is another tool I have to meaningfully crank up the tension and stakes for that character. These single traits have immediate implications on my story. They were co-developed at the table, and they did not require additional pages of backstory. For now, for you and me, a single thread can be enough. This is efficient world building, and we'll do a lot more of it in step 4, tighten your story. This is the best part. For me, it's when the plan begins to feel real because we're making specific narrative and game decisions at the intersection of 3 things. What matters to your characters? What matters to you, the DM? And what feels reasonable to run? Obviously, everyone's diagram is different. And even if you're running the same campaign, that center section is going to be composed differently. But I'll share 5 or 6 of the decisions that I made, the specific decisions, to begin to create a Storm King's Thunder campaign that I'm excited to run and feels achievable. My players started at level 4. This choice won't be for everyone, for every group, but my players were excited to experience a giant threat, and I wanted to get them there as fast as possible. By skipping the introduction adventure and doing a little bit of narrative work ahead of our first session, we were able to jump right into the action and that core threat. If your players like low-level play, or you want the threat to be a little bit more slow burn, obviously that's great. For me, starting at 4 meant 10 sessions that I didn't have to plan, and I could invest that time into details that had more weight. I made factions matter. The threat in Storm King's Thunder is very tangible, and it was intuitive to me that the forces of the world would have already started mobilizing against it. When I first started, I was nervous, as you might be, that introducing factions meant introducing complexity, with more relationships to manage and motivations to track, but I found the opposite to be true. At least at the beginning, factions can be very simple. They have grounded my players to the world and each other through that shared narrative history. My Dwarf Necromancer and Reborn Monk both have dealings with the Zentarum, which gives them something to connect over, but it also empowers me to deliver quests or clues or misdirection from a source that they might be more authentically already expecting to deal with. My Firbolg Druid is a member of the Emerald Enclave, a naturalist group with ties to the Harpers. So now if I need a character to seem trustworthy, flashing that Harper badge carries a lot of weight. Or destroying a tract of land that the Emerald Enclave is sworn to protect feels that much more additionally devastating.
I've run 6 sessions of my campaign, and already my players are building these networks of NPCs with ties to one another across the continent, as opposed to a more disparate system of interesting but totally individual characters. As a new DM, trying to create a world that matters but keep as little in my head as possible, that has been invaluable. Factions reduce work, they do not add it. Would recommend. 5 Giant Lords is too many Giant Lords. The book as written can make you feel responsible for making every potential Giant Lord feel equally compelling and interesting, which to me was completely overwhelming. Instead, I spent my time planning and emphasizing the Giant Lords that I was excited about and I thought my players' characters would feel compelled by. Player agency and unbound player choice are not the same thing, and removing some choice is not the same thing as railroading. The Fire Giants have played a very big role in the beginning of my campaign because their destruction of land is compelling to my druid, and they have a natural history with my dwarf. Their initial threat is also very literal and powerful. It will be quite a few sessions before the greater evil and those implications are discovered. So in the meantime, the Fire Giants tearing up the world is very easy to grasp, and the potential destruction is hard to ignore. I am also building out Countess Sensuri, the Cloud Giant. I just think the idea of a floating giant castle in the sky feels very magical, it feels very whimsical, and it's a nice contrast to the typically more brutish physical giants in the rest of the world. It's also been a very simple one to drop seeds about. So in my very first session, our monk heard this drunk mercenary swearing that they were attacked by a castle floating in the sky. That feels very high fantasy and fun to me, but it's also very easy for me to commit to or have just been a passing story depending on what the characters are interested in. And that's it. Duke Zalto, Countess Sensuri, our ancient blue dragon, Imrith, and the day-to-day mysteries and conflicts feels like more than enough to build a really compelling narrative around, one that I'm excited to run, but still has plenty of flexibility so that my players feel that they have their agency. In my game, the Frost and Hill Giants exist as background threats, and Stone Giants and how they want to destroy the world because of their dreams or whatever, they just never clicked for me. So they're barely making an appearance at all in my world, which in my opinion is fine. 3 starting locations is too many starting locations. The first true catalyst for adventure in Storm King's Thunder is when one of 3 unique locations is attacked by one of 3 unique Giant Lords, which your players end up at depending on which quest hook they take at the end of the introductory adventure. Preparing to bring 3 locations to life and populating them with details that matter to your story just felt like a waste of time. Instead, because we started at level 4 and skipped that introductory adventure, my players started in Tribor, and it's almost immediately attacked by fire giants, one of the forces we know that we want to matter to the players. The time I saved from preparing only that one location meant that I could tune my NPCs and their quests and their backstories and the locations to be significantly more connected to the main story, which was way more fun to run. And lastly, we're going to foreshadow the Ancient Blue Dragon. As written, Imrith, an Ancient Blue Dragon who has gone to incredible lengths to upset the natural order of the world and is the singular catalyst for the campaign, feels very distant. Her first appearance is terrifying, but it's terrifying because dragons are terrifying, not because there's any recognition of who she is or what that implies. it's surprising in the same way that a jump scare is surprising. So I know that we want to look for opportunities to signal her presence, her power, and her plan throughout the adventure, ahead of the drama of that first meeting. And this doesn't mean that I'm investing any additional time for now building out additional backstory or new locations. We're just going to take her most recognizable traits and scatter them in front of the players as they explore the world. So things like shape-shifting, bright blue eyes, lightning energy, the ability to create statues, these are things that will now find themselves in front of the path of our players. So maybe a shopkeep who they convinced to help them is suddenly found turned to stone, or a mysterious woman with magical bright blue eyes had come into town the night before asking about the party. Even with fairly minimal effort, I think these details will help me build a more full, compelling mystery and a better villain. Once you've read the book, learned what your characters care about, and decided what you care about, you have enough information to roughly map your story, which is essential, in my opinion, to our goal of right-sized campaign planning and world building. Storm King's Thunder actually has a nice flowchart in the beginning of the book, and I think that is a perfectly suitable starting place. But we are going to get even more specific. And that's because we want a good enough idea of where we want our players to go that we can build ahead of time compelling reasons for them to go there. This is my example of my general campaign map. Start in Tribor. At the conclusion of the giant fight, a Harper quest draws them to Everland. On the way, they'll pass through Yartar, which will give us an opportunity to run the Kraken's Gamble side quest and foreshadow the Kraken Society. There's room there for side quests and exploration, but eventually they'll make their way to Everland. Along the way, they might meet Zephyros or Sensori, or maybe stop at Calling Horns, depending on which NPCs they've interacted with. They'll meet Crowan in Everland, who becomes a pseudo-patron, is able to give them some critical information and send them on a quest north for the first time. They'll meet Harshnag, and buffeted between side quests and NPCs they may be interested in, they'll make their way to the Eye of the Allfather, meet the Oracle, get some answers, and fight Imrith for the first time. From there, they can travel to a giant lair. We're going to skip the ancient burial sites because they are both crazy insensitive and very boring, and we're not taking the time to fix either one of those things. They'll teleport to Maelstrom, save Hecaton, fight Imrith, profit. There are also several dwarven locations, the Feywild and the High Forest, all of which are meaningful to my players and give me the option for compelling additional hooks. But even this map, as broad and flexible and sweeping as it is, reduces the amount of world I have to build down from everything. It means that every quest and clue and NPC backstory that I've created has mattered in some way to this main thread, which creates opportunities for short and long-term payoff. If one of your biggest barriers to DMing was scale, like it was for me, especially for a campaign like Storm King's Thunder, this made things feel possible. And to be clear, this map is missing hours of creativity and detail, most of which will be co-created at the table. But that's what next session is for. Like I mentioned before, the next video will be about the first 3 sessions of my own game. So we'll get into the details of session planning, and I'll share everything that I created to help me feel prepared, how I populated Tribor with relevant hooks for the story that I wanted to run, how I approached the design of the phases of the giant battle, and how my players responded. That's coming soon. See ya.